This month again, we are going to be looking at Pale Blue Dot by the late Carl Sagan. We're going to be taking questions from his daughter, Sasha Sagan. And so please, if you get a head start on this book, on the back of your flyer, we give you a contact information to be able to actually a link to be able to go and listen to or watch the entire book. So get your questions in early, and we will, when we interview Sasha, we'll have her questions. But just to give you a taste of next month, before we get back to our current book, I want to show you this little 3-minute video. It's a soliloquy by Carl Sagan on the pale blue dot. So let's watch that now.
That's here.
That's here.
That's home.
That's home.
That's us.
That's us.
On it.
On it.
Everyone you love.
Everyone you love.
Everyone you know. Everyone you ever heard of. Every human being who ever was lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering. Thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines. Every hunter and forager. Every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit? Yes. Settle? Not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. It has been said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known.
We detected an in-class planet. Okay, so anyway, looking forward to that. And one of the things that you might want to be looking at as you're reading next month's book is, what was Carl Sagan's, and that's a great maybe question to ask his daughter, what was his worldview? I don't know that he would be comfortable, I don't think he ever identified as agnostic or atheist. So is he somewhat more maybe akin to pantheism in some way, or?
The internet says pantheism, or close to it.
Yeah, and so
I heard it from Sasha that they had a nanny. Sasha had a nanny growing up. She was a devout Christian who was a nun. I think it was in Tibet or some far-reaching area. She was a missionary nun, really devout, and worked for the Sagans. She was a Christian, and Mom and Dad did not prohibit her from speaking about her faith to Sasha when Sasha was a child. So that says something about he wasn't an atheist. Sasha is not an atheist, but she's certainly not in any sort of religious tradition at the moment. But her father was not an atheist at home. At least there wasn't this hardcore, I know there's no God kind of thing. But it was just really neat to hear that story. That I had no idea that they had a Christian nanny in the house, and Dad was okay with that.
Well, when you say the cosmos is all that ever is, it's all that ever was, and all that ever will be, and you have a worldview in which you are a product of the cosmos, but that's not a personal but impersonal entity, then that does have a lot of parallels with pantheism, which is going to be the topic in December, which is what we're going to be looking at with The Secret. Yes.
Did you notice that odd comment he made in that soliloquy about who will save us from ourselves? I thought that was real odd.
Well, one thing I liked about Carl Sagan is very articulate. He will make you think. He did it on the Cosmos series, and and this might be one that we would break the rule and do a fictional work, but the Contact, which is his novel, which became the movie, that was it's so impactful on so many levels. I haven't even read the book. Just the movie was like, I was like 2 weeks later, still my mind was reeling from that. So, how many of you saw Contact, or how many read the book? Okay.
Movie night.
Movie night. Maybe we do a movie night. Let me do that. So, but let's go back to our the story of the cosmos. And again, we want to thank Alan Hengline as well as Daniel Ray. Alan's also a member of the club, so it's amazing the number of club members. This is what, the third one you've been to, I think.
Yes.
And Daniel's of course a regular member of the club. So it's amazing the number of authors that we have that are part of the club as well. So, does anybody have a question that I saw some hands before the break that you didn't get a chance to, George?
Yeah, I had a question for Alan about the facts that sort of form the basis of the fine-tuning argument. Why should we not simply interpret those as like a brute fact? That's just how it is. We shouldn't try to explain it because maybe there is no explanation. It's just kind of there.
Well, that's a good question. If naturalism is true, they pretty much have to just be brute facts. Once you get to the bottom of science, and of course we could always make some new discoveries for deeper laws, but right now the fine-tuning it's solely based on the most foundational levels of physics. And so what you're looking at then is you're looking at a possible theistic explanation when there's not one being offered from naturalism, because there's no gap in the theory. You're just looking at everything we know about theoretical physics and then looking at, well, there's this pattern of coincidences where all these things have to be just right for life. And so then you can ask the question, is there an explanation for that or not? If naturalism is true, there wouldn't be, but if theism is true, then there would be. And in fact, it's at least not too improbable to think that God would want life. And that's all you need. Even if there's a 1 in a million chance God would want life, this comes through as very strong evidence for God over and against the atheist hypothesis due to the level of the fine-tuning. And that's what should really get your attention, is the level of the fine-tuning. If these were just, okay, 1 in 10, 1 in 100, whatever, okay, maybe we just got lucky, no big deal, there's nothing necessarily to explain. But it's only when people started seeing this like 1 in 10 to the 90th, that's like finding a random subatomic particle from anywhere in the whole universe, and we just talked about how big it is. So these are very improbable kinds of things, and there's other very improbable aspects as well.
There's one.
Well, Chris doesn't believe this. Do you believe that?
Well, I just wanted to ask, is it better to have any explanation, or is it better to have the correct explanation?
Obviously, you want the correct explanation. And so what you're trying to do here is look at candidate theories. Sean Carroll says that the fine-tuning argument plays by the rules. You're trying to look at the universe as we find it. It's also going along with the Dawkins thing. Let's look at the universe at bottom. Does it fit better on theism or atheism? Obviously, you've got other work to do. You've got the problem of evil. You've got other aspects that
Yeah,
are
but
challenging.
you would
but-
agree, it takes 2 supernova explosions to get the heavy elements, right?
At least one, anyway.
Okay, at least one, whatever. And the heavy elements are carbon or iron, right?
Well, yeah, what you really care about are the ones critical to life, which
Are what?
obviously it's carbon and oxygen and nitrogen and. many
But it's a
beyond that.
supernova explosion.
That's
a
what
star
you need to
explosion.
distribute them
Absolutely.
sufficiently.
And what is sun composed of? Is it not hydrogen and helium?
Primarily, yes.
So, what do we need? All we need in the beginning was hydrogen. We don't need anything else, do we?
Well, you need an environment in which structure formation can occur, galaxy formation, things like that, and that's the way that in which cosmological constant messes things up. I mean, Luke Barnes with a whole team of scientists do these simulations, and even without simulations, you had atheists like Nobel Prize winner Steven Weinberg saying there's no way you're ever going to explain this apart from the multiverse, and so he started positing the multiverse theory.
But just looking at the brute fact, if we got hydrogen, we can get this ball rolling and get the
Well,
heavy elements, and in turn get.
If you can form long-lived
Earth.
stars. Now, think about what a star is. It's a nuclear bomb held together by gravity. How is it that you have it fine-tuned to last 10 billion years? It takes a lot of fine-tuning to have a long-lived star.
Just to get a star, you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then what's interesting about star formation in the early universe, and you can fill in my blanks here, Alan, if you want, there are these things called population 3 stars. And what they are stars in the early universe that would have been composed mostly of hydrogen and helium because that's all you had. According to the current models of the way things form, as Bill said, the postulating is stars explode to create or cook the heavier elements, carbon, iron, and nickel, and all those metals. So when you don't have heavier element star supernovas producing heavier elements, your early universe is just hydrogen helium stars, which are called population 3 stars. These things have to explode like popcorn in order to create the kind of stars, population 1 and 2 stars that we have now. And what's really odd right now is that there's absolutely no trace of population 3 stars anywhere in the universe. Not even trace supernova of hydrogen, helium. No, they're absolutely fundamental to star formation theory, but they're absolutely non-existent. And so the current explanation is they all exploded in a past time boundary that we can no longer see. But the assumption could be that if there were so many doing so many different explosions, we should at least have a couple of stragglers or some kind of evidence that there was a large contingent of hydrogen helium stars exploding, but it's just non-existent.
That's crazy.
I'm not saying they don't, but that's just star formation theory seems pretty simple when you read it in popular literature. And for the most part, but as Alan said, you absolutely have to have a knife edge balance between supernuclear fusion in the core of the star, not too much, not too little, and then you have to have the gravity to match it. If you have too much gravity, you crush the whole process. If you don't have enough gravity, the thing just flies apart. And how does this stability, how do you balance that knife edge for 10 million years or however long it is? So stars are incredibly complex machines. I mean, the proton-proton chains, how nuclear fusion occurs, just the right amount of nuclear fusion, it's remarkable.
These events that you're discussing, those events that you're discussing, they happen because there are constants. Though we don't know all of their values, we do know they are constants, which means that they don't change. And what that means is that there's order in the universe. And the way that you're saying it, there was a period when there was just stars forming. That isn't accurate. Star formation started off at a particular time in the universe's evolution. As it developed and expanded, started to develop the potential for stars to be born. And what that meant is that stars cycled through their life cycles in accordance with cosmological theory, which is a very ordered set of events, and stars go through this regularly, and we can see it in the night sky. And what people don't understand is that these stars can be huge. Our sun is actually a very small star.
Yeah, they would agree with that.
And since you have stars that can be absolutely gigantic, they can be on the cycle of the sun's development of a star's development wherein they are able to create the elements in their core.
So what is
Now
your
that's
point?
where the elements come from. It isn't from some magic. Now these stars,
Right.
they continue to exist and continue to propagate because we have constants in the universe. The universe is an ordered machine.
So your point is that we don't need God. It's doing fine by itself, correct?
Exactly.
So what y'all's,
Well, I mean, the fine tuning though is, and this is just well accepted physics, that, you know, if you change these constants, if a strong nuclear force changed by 1 part in 250, then it messes up the ability to produce both carbon and oxygen in stars. So either you don't have water or you don't have carbon. Those seem like big problems for life. You need some fine tuning just to have long-lived stars.
so you can't even get the stars to do their job if you don't have these constants that are problems.
Yeah, to at least have, I would say, long-lived stars,
I've
or
heard-
to have the kind of, like the Camacho constant would prevent any stars as well. You wouldn't have galaxies.
Now, I heard,
Okay,
you can
here's
correct me,
the
let me get it, make sure I've got a correction on that. Just on the rate of expansion, if it had been different either direction, you wouldn't have anything but hydrogen, or maybe hydrogen and helium?
Well, I would want to be careful, because what a lot of people cite is the early density of the universe, but inflation might explain all or most of that, although there's problems with fine-tuning needed for inflation as well. But if you talk about the cosmological constant, this relates to the energy density of the vacuum of space, and that's in play throughout the entire history of the universe, and that's what's causing the universe to accelerate right now in its expansion. And it just, the bigger it gets, the faster the acceleration is. It's a
What do
runaway
you think,
effect.
Ken?
I wonder if there's a difference between Dan and Alan on the point that I'm about to ask. So granted that you both believe that fine tuning is required for this universe to exist as it does. I'm giving you that.
For life.
Giving you that.
Anyway.
But I wonder if there's a difference. Dan seems to be arguing that star formation is kind of an improbable thing, a naturalistic star formation. Given that the initial settings of the universe are tweaked just right, do you believe in a kind of a naturalistic evolution and formation of the stars and planets and galaxies?
I do, yeah. I don't see, I mean, it also doesn't preclude God could create a star from scratch if he wanted, and,
Right.
you know.
I want to get.
But I don't necessarily
I wonder if there's any
see,
daylight between you two on that.
I see that fine tuning is needed for long-lived stars, but I don't see that it's, it's, I think Hugh Ross has said it's easier than forming a rain cloud. Once you have the laws of physics right, you can
And why
form
is a
stars.
long-lived star necessary? Couldn't it have just been 6,000 years ago and been fine for life?
It could have been if God created things a certain way, he could have
Right.
done that.
But the length of time that it's been around is sort of a prediction of naturalism, right? You would have to have a universe that's old under naturalism.
Yeah.
Whereas under theism, it could either be young or old. You don't know ahead of time. You can't call it ahead of time. Whereas under naturalism, you call it. You have to say the universe has to be old in order to support.
Yeah, our star's 5 billion years old.
Right,
If
in
it's
order
1
for
billion, it's too
life
young. If
to
it's 10 billion,
evolve.
it's
Yeah.
done, yeah.
Right.
Right?
So-
Yeah. But
That's-
see, now again, the answers, these young Earth people are going to say, oh, we don't like that star evolution stuff. Am I not right?
I'm sure a lot of them don't
Yeah,
like
well, there
it,
you
but
go.
Well, let me, as not being a physicist, let me ask the most basic question. Where did the fine tuning come from that put God together?
well, the hypothesis of God is that of a being that's uncreated. And I think you get some evidence from just thinking about the nature of reality. Either there's an infinite regress of causes, or there's some stopping point in explanations. For a long time, skeptics thought, well, maybe matter's just been around forever, in which case maybe it doesn't need an explanation. But we now know that matter hasn't been around forever. There was a beginning, not just to matter and energy, but to space and time. And so I think it's very plausible then to think that God is the best explanation of the universe just existing, and
But you would
therefore,
define God as being outside of time and space.
Exactly.
yeah. And so, yeah, the fine tuning, it looks very, very rigged for life. That would demand a very powerful being. But if you also have independent evidence of a creator creating the universe, well, that would also be evidence
Ron,
of
you
the
gotta-
same kind of being.
And beyond what Alan just said, isn't an infinite regress logically impossible?
Yes.
We've never gotten.
Yeah, they wind it back down to the it was expanding
It
and
can't be
it comes to a
an infinite
singularity.
path.
Yeah.
It's impossible logically.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I'm
see,
surprised
here's-
scientists didn't
You run
recognize
into problems
that.
with the second law as
Yeah,
well.
the causality, so this is my layman's brain, because Alan's higher on the science than I am, but, so you have a book on a table, and So what's holding the book up? The table. What's holding the table up? The floor. What's holding the floor up? The foundation. What's holding the foundation up? The earth. What's holding the earth up? Space-time fabric. How many things are in that chain of support? Because the farther away I go in explaining it, the farther back in time I'm going. So there's a literal impossibility that I can't have an infinite set of explanations to talk about what's finally holding up my book. What is finally holding up my book?
It's turtles all the way down.
It's turtles all the way down. Yeah, yeah. I mean that was Stephen Hawking colloquially responding to somebody. But at the popular level of cosmology, when you read books, our target audience, the Sean Carrolls, the Neil deGrasse Tysons, the people that write the books for the Carl Sagans. One thing you always run into in the metaphors and the language, because I'm a literature person, and so I pay attention to the words that I'm being used to describe what the universe is like. And as Alan has pointed out, when you get back to the beginning or near the beginning of our universe, you run into some vocabulary that sounds awfully theistic or monotheistic. You get something like infinity, you get things that are pre-existing or eternal, things that are very powerful, something that's ordered, and so it's almost like they're borrowing metaphors from monotheism to explain a singularity from which comes laws that have been around a long time, maybe forever, that is very powerful, and suddenly you have cosmologists talking like theologians. And there's a quote, I don't know if it's in the book or not, but from an agnostic astronomer, Robert Jastrow.
Oh.
Yeah, everybody probably has read it at least once. You know,
Yeah.
the physicist is climbing the mountain,
mountain.
and by the time he's just about to pull himself over the top, and then there sees a band of theologians that have been sitting there for centuries. And that, if you read the popular literature, if you read the Sean Carrolls and Lawrence Krauses and the Carl Sagans and Neil deGrasse Tysons, that is exactly where they are right now. They are at the precipice using language like theologians.
That's why Einstein had trouble overcoming, even on his theories, that it just sounded too much like theism.
Yeah.
You know.
So what we gonna say, Chris?
I was gonna say, is that because the God language has actual reality behind it, or because the language that they're using to communicate about it, like everyone, like God is pervasive in our culture.
Sure.
Any variety of God. So it's useful for explaining things, for speaking to a popular audience about these. Okay, how can I put this in terms that these people are going to understand? How people will know what a God is.
Yeah.
And so that may not be a sign that they're actually approaching the truth of God. Is that they've found, like you said, because the language you're using.
Yeah, on naturalism, it's just kind of funny that we end up having to resort to God language to explain the universe.
One more point to make about what Ken raised, which is interesting. I like the way you're thinking as far as, well, what is the prediction on naturalism versus theism? But I think you can historically look at what was the prediction on naturalism with respect to the age of the universe. It was that it was infinitely old. It had been around forever.
Steady state.
And that was a big problem for accepting the Big Bang when it was first proposed.
Mm-hmm. Where
James was talking
even
about.
in the Middle Ages, and of course all the way back to Genesis, if you want that, you have the idea on monotheism that matter was not eternal and that God spoke the universe into existence out of nothing, ex nihilo. And of course, at least from the Greeks and certainly by the Enlightenment, that was ridiculed because the model was steady state. The universe has always existed. It needed no explanation. And so if you say, what would we predict the universe to look like? The Christians said, we predict a universe that's not eternal, that had a beginning, matter, energy, space, and time. And lo and behold, that's what we found, and at least that's the model that's accepted today. Now, it doesn't mean that we won't have a new model 10 years from now.
And there's always been a difference.
Contrasting that with kind of the pervasive view in the history of the church that the earth is only thousands of years old. I know Augustine is an exception, but the prevailing view has been that it's been, relatively small. The universe is relatively small. You've got the firmament, you've got there was no concept of galaxies and
of course, everybody thought the universe was small.
Right. There's no. But under naturalism, you had to expand both the size and the age of the universe in order to get off the ground the theories that they were proposing.
You do have in Psalms, you have the psalmist.
Yeah, that's the thing. That only come about when science developed far enough in advance to see that the Earth was old.
Oh, well, I mean, Darwin didn't know how old the Earth was. He predicted it was billions of years old, or at least hundreds of millions. But so, in fact, there was a dispute between between Darwin and Kelvin.
Right.
Kelvin thought it was only like 20 million years old, and Darwin said, no, it used to be longer than that. And lo and behold, it's 4.5 billion years old. So Darwin vindicated on that.
So what were you saying about the Psalms?
Well, in Psalms 8, you do see evidence in other places where the ancient Hebrews, I think, did see that the universe might be quite large, and they even appealed, like in Psalms 8, I think.
You
it
got
is.
Bible for that verse?
Look at Psalms 8, I think it is, and
Yeah, but don't you think you're just feeding stuff into that, you know, I mean, trying to...
I don't think there's any level of specificity in terms
Yeah,
of like
thank you.
how, but it's just, he wasn't bothered by the concept of the pale blue dot kind of thinking. It was
Well-
more of like this vast universe. What is man that you think about him in this vast universe kind of,
Yeah, the
kind of
Psalm,
thinking.
the Psalm,
Yeah, we'll give him that.
Psalm 8:3 is David. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou dost take thought of him, and the son of man that thou dost care for him? In a way, the pale blue dot soliloquy that we saw is
It was very
precisely
similar.
what David is doing, is that when we contemplate the cosmos, the immediate secondary question is, what am I in all of this? It's almost like there's an
We all feel
intrinsic,
that, right?
yeah, there's an intrinsic, look up, and all of a sudden, it's like the stars spill out, who are you?
It's
You
very
know?
humbling.
And it is.
And the more we learn about the universe, it just makes it that much worse as far as that feeling of,
Yeah.
if size matters at all, then it's very, and or time. If you think of, all of human existence being, if you put all of cosmic time as a 24-hour clock, we're not in the last full second. It's a fraction of a second.
What better way to humble
Melita
kings,
had a question. Go ahead, Melita.
It was just going back to,
Speak up.
when you were talking about the old perspectives of the small universe, and now we have this much bigger, the more we're learning, the bigger the universe. But the more we're learning, we're also discovering the more complex life is. Darwin also thought that life was just little bits of jelly. I mean,
Right.
Dr. Werner Dietz' work on information theory is what led him to become a believer.
Right.
Things like, so it kind of is both, because the more we're learning about the size and the immense, amazing universe that we live in, we're also discovering at the micro level the intense, the complexity of the DNA, the complex, they really thought they created the building blocks of life with the Urey-Miller experiment, and all they did was get a bunch of amino acids that didn't even have the right chirality, and they were all mixed, to line up to be
Right.
proteins. So
Yeah.
so it kind of is
We
both.
we can have that discussion
Yeah,
about
so
the
there's both.
origin of life and stuff, but I think you're making my point for me that the more complex life turns out to be, the more demanding we have to be of a bigger universe and an older universe in order to even allow that to be a remote possibility.
Unless,
Assuming naturality.
Exactly.
if you start from that is where life came from, or God.
Right.
Which would be
But if we can
life,
stick
which
to the-
actually follows what we
Right.
know, that life creates.
But if you need
I'm just saying
fine-tuning
there's-
to give
it
you that
also
complex
can be
life.
both points. And then we're finding more about the fine-tuning because we're learning about this incredible, so what I'm saying is, we're learning about this immensity, but we're also learning about the complexity.
It's not,
And
it's not helping
complexity
fine
is
tuning
that-
when you need all the it's not helping naturalism, you need all that fine tuning to give you
So
that.
it's both.
And it's off topic tonight, but the complexity and the information, the incredibly high level of information.
I didn't mean to get off
is-
topic. I'm sorry.
It's off topic, but
Like-
I think that what I take from tonight is, what we all should take out of here is that you can love science. And science can even lead you from a period of not believing or questioning into inferring that the best explanation for the fine-tuning, incredible fine-tuning at the moment of the singularity, all the way to the fine-tuning today, the Goldilocks principle of our planet that we live on, this controlled nuclear reaction thing that's floating out there that we're spinning around, that gives us just exactly the right amount of energy for our planet and our radius. And then the computer program in every one of the trillion cells in your body, that we've never seen any kind of simple computer program that wasn't programmed by an intelligence. And so for me, this brings me out of a period of serious questioning and doubt to inferring that the most reasonable conclusion is that there has to be an intelligent mind behind the universe and behind life. Now, what is that mind?
I concur with that, what you're saying, but what I want us to do as a club, after this month and into next month when we look at Pale Blue Dot, is try to say, how can people just like us look at that same data and say, look at all the black holes. There's too many. There has to be no God, because it's a violent universe. It's not fine-tuned for life. There's just one speck, this one pale blue dot where life might be possible. So that same amount of evidence would, the same exact evidence would lead you into the opposite conclusion. So I want to address the question, why do we get two opposite conclusions from the same data? But also ask the question, how do we prevent ourselves from, because I'm leaning toward it's just what your worldview is going to dictate this. And so how do we, is it a form of confirmation bias? And so how can we best try to counteract that or allow for it to be able to come into this with a more, neutral understanding of this?
I think one thing that would help, and may not be beyond us as a club, but if we could put out in precise logical terms, this, there, and plus this equals this.
And really, syllogism or something?
Yeah, basically syllogistic things, because I've heard very little things. I hear this thing connected to this thing, and they're not connecting the dots between them. And there's
that would be your homework assignment. For
okay, well, I can do that. Give me a couple of specifics to work with. Okay, but yeah, I mean, because that's what, and
I'm telling you, when you listen to or read, I just listened to it so far, but he's going to make a compelling case. Yeah. If you just let yourself try to be neutral, just listen to it, and he makes some good points.
Yeah, well, see, something like that is what I call the size fallacy, and that's come up a little bit in things like that, because if smaller is less important, if we take that as a syllogism, is smaller is less important, we are smaller than this, therefore we are less important. But the premise, smaller is less important, I would challenge.
Yeah,
I'm taller than most people here. That means the rest of you are not as good as me, right?
What about the Men in Black, where there's an entire galaxy around on the collar of the hat?
Maybe we should watch that movie at one of our meetings.
Well, I think that maybe this is self-serving, but to answer your question, James, maybe it would be instructive for those who haven't changed their worldview in terms of the existence of God and so forth, to ask people to, just have a conversation, one-on-one conversation with people who have changed their worldview, and to see why they held to that view before and why they no longer do now. Whether they went from atheism to Christianity or from Christianity to atheism, whichever direction.
I concur with Ken that more just like listening and trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes is going to go a long way to settling this interpretive problem we have.
Yeah, I don't think we'll ever overcome it, but we can try to compensate for it.
Helpful. There are some that will be convinced, and some will never be.
My own experience with part of getting this book together was doing exactly that. I'm an adult convert. I've been a Christian for 26 years. I was not a Christian in my mid-20s. I came to Christ. But in the last 5 years, in my grad school and getting the book together, I've been on not only a part of this group, but I've been on several atheist podcasts, popular atheist podcasts, listening to skepticism and unbelief and talking to people. And one of the driving things for this book was to actually take what I've listened to from non-Christians and compile a book that would be an intelligent response to what I often have heard in these conversations, is that Christians are ignorant of science. They don't know anything about the universe. There's a lot of mean sort of antagonism toward religion and science, and so one of the things I wanted to do was intelligently address the sort of, not this group per se, but just the minimalistic atheistic pushback, and to give people a perspective that here are different Christians from different backgrounds, and some of the contributors have different viewpoints on the age of the universe, coming together for the glory of God. That is our key text, is Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. So I can tell you that what Ken is saying is a good thing to do, and to gain an audience with somebody that has changed their mind, was a Christian, became an atheist, was an atheist, became a Christian, and have that conversation. They're important conversations to have. So part of what went into this book was part of those conversations, and I tried to write my chapter for a wider audience, both to exhort Christians and to encourage Christians, but also to address the kinds of questions I heard from atheists as I talked to them.
And I might add to that, when engaging with somebody like that who has changed position, don't go into it trying to convince them of your position. Go into it wanting to learn. What is it that caused that change to happen?
Absolutely.
Right.
There's a third category of priest, and is somebody who has gone through a period of doubt but come back to their original conclusion again too.
Right, right. Those are all interesting categories. I like to,
Yeah.
I'm especially drawn to read people who have, especially when I was, shortly after I deconverted, I was hungry to find anybody who had been a Christian and then became a non-believer and then went back to becoming a Christian again. Because most of the people you hear or read are people that have always
one
been
way.
been one way, or maybe they've just gone one direction. But going in and back out, that's an interesting one.
So was it, I think Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living, is attributed to him, but yeah, we want to do that in the club. And I see examples of that from both sides of the floor. So I've got a video, and I'll let Bill introduce it. Bill watched a video where Melissa Kane Travis is addressing her chapter in the book. The Story
Right,
of the
she's a
Cosmos.
really sharp girl and just very articulate. And I found her arguments very compelling about the intelligibility and how is it that we just evolved and we were able to understand complex mathematics. She makes a brilliant argument, and it's sad. It's really sad that the churches have Beth Moore and Joyce Meyer as their go-to women, and this girl has like zero audience.
But isn't that a good thing if you're
She's
wanting to
gaining
promote?
audience, so. She's gaining audience.
Yeah, well, get out of your ivory tower and get on the friggin'.
Wouldn't that be a good thing if you're trying to promote atheism?
Yeah, well, whatever.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and watch this video. This is
I'm
Melissa
trying to help her,
Melissa Kane Travis and her chapter in the book. She's just addressing. I think it's about an 8-minute clip.
Thank you for all being here this evening on a weeknight in the summer. I'm honored that you would come out to help us celebrate the release of Story of the Cosmos. The title of my chapter is A Glorious Resonance, the Intelligibility of Nature and the Imago Dei. Fast forward again, and we come to this gentleman, Philo of Alexandria. What's significant about Philo of Alexandria is that he was a Jewish monotheist. He was a Jewish monotheist who was very well educated in the Pythagorean Platonic tradition. He was very, very well read in that philosophy and liked it a lot. But he wanted to reconcile ancient Greek philosophy, particularly that tradition, with his Jewish theology. So what Philo said was, of course there was a rational plan for creation, but this plan pre-existed in the mind of God. So you see the dramatic philosophical shift there. We went from Plato, who said, no, there's this plan that coexisted with the craftsman that exists out in the abstract, and he didn't create that plan. He was bound by that plan in order to be able to produce a rational universe. But Philo strongly disagreed because of his Jewish monotheism. He said, no, of course there was a rational plan, but this rational plan has existed from eternity in the mind of God. And then he went beyond this, just like Plato did, and he said the divine reason, the rationality of God, is made manifest in the tangible creation, but also in the mind of man. So when he said this, he tied it to the Hebrew doctrine of man being made in the image of God. So before we get to Galileo, let me back up one more time. So what happened after this was the philosophy of Philo was adopted by some of the early Christian church fathers, early Christian theologians. Surprisingly, Philo didn't end up being much of an influence at all on subsequent Jewish philosophy, which is very surprising, but an enormous influence on Christian philosophy of religion, Christian natural theology. So if you want to read a little bit more about that, I mentioned in the chapter that St. Augustine of Hippo is a good one to read, who adopted the exact same idea that Philo had about the plan for creation pre-existing in the mind of God. And he explains why stopping with just a rational plan the way Plato did, a plan that coexisted outside of God, that God had nothing to do with, actually ends up in heresy. So very interesting point to read about. Fast forward again, and we come to the scientific revolution, and you're all familiar with Galileo Galilei. Besides his big famous dust-up with the Roman Catholic Church, you may remember that he was famous for developing telescopes, not the original inventor, but he was able to develop telescopes that were able to assist him in stellar observations, and he ended up making some observations that went to support the theory of heliocentrism, or the idea that the sun is at the center rather than the planet Earth being at the center and everything revolving around planet Earth. So he made some observations that went on to support that theory. But the remarkable thing about Galileo's thought was that he would often wax a little philosophical about his work, about the orderliness of the cosmos, the grandeur of the cosmos. And one of the things he said was, this all-encompassing book that is constantly open before our eyes, that is the universe, is written in mathematical language. He said it's written in mathematical language. So I want you to stop and notice the continuity of the intellectual history that I've told you so far, going all the way back to Pythagoras. This idea of mathematics, of number, being somehow fundamental to our material reality. Now, a contemporary of Galileo was our Wayne, our beloved Johannes Kepler. My cat's name is Kepler. I should have brought you a picture because he has really long white hair around his neck, and it's really uncanny, I'm telling you. So Johannes Kepler, one of my intellectual heroes, he was actually the centerpiece figure of my dissertation work. I just can't even tell you how much of a hero he is to me. But Kepler, like Galileo and like many of the great thinkers before him, was amazed by the rationality of the cosmos and the fact that we are able to do science. And he said, to God, there are in the whole material world material laws, figures, and relations of most special excellency and of the most appropriate order. So he's talking about the laws of science. And these figures and relations, he's talking about the mathematics of these laws. He says these laws are within the grasp of the human mind. God wanted us to recognize them by creating us after his own image so that we could share in his own thoughts. So this is the bottom part of this quote is the one that you may have heard paraphrased before. It's often paraphrased as when we do science, we're thinking God's thoughts after him. But this is actually the exact wording of what it was that Johannes Kepler said. Okay, so here we are at the scientific revolution, and we're looking at this really remarkable situation that we find ourselves in with the laws of nature being written in mathematics and the world being orderly in such a way that mathematics can tap into the material secrets of the universe. And then we have these minds that can pull it all together and make scientific discovery. So all of these philosophers and great men of science, they were recognizing how absolutely remarkable this is. Now, if we take Kepler's ideas, not just from these quotes, but from his broader writings, we can actually create an interesting little schematic. And I call this the Keplerian three-part harmony. Remember, we're talking about the cosmic resonance of mathematics, the material stuff of the world, and human rationality. This is how Kepler explained the situation. He said what it really boils down to is that there was a mathematical archetype a mathematical plan that pre-existed the universe. And I have it at the top of the triangle because Kepler insisted it existed in the mind of God. This archetype was made manifest in the material world as the copy of the archetype. But not only that, man was created in the image of God, and because we are created in God's image, there is an analogy between the divine rationality and the rationality of human beings. So we have man created in the image of God, observing the copy and discerning that there must have been an archetype, and that archetype had to have existed eternally in the mind of the Creator.
Okay, well, what was your thoughts on that?
I think it's a fantastic argument.
I've seen a lot of reading about how this whole idea of why is the universe comprehensible?
Mm-hmm.
You know, all we are is matter, you know, that's coalesced, but somehow we are able to know reality. You know, in the far-reaching part
And
of the
something as
galaxy.
complex as mathematics. I mean, how does that happen? You got any thoughts?
Well, beyond the fact that we can comprehend it, why do we care to? I mean, if all we are driven by are survivalist imperatives, why do we think about music and mathematics and art and all the things that we think about, you know?
Yeah,
let me say this.
Chris, save the day,
On a
baby.
lower
Come on.
level, let me say, play devil's advocate for a minute. On a lower level, you know, there's some basic maths that would be helping survival. I mean, just to be able to count your sheep and know when some are missing or something like that would help on a primitive level. But I think what you're saying is, how does this help you to be able to procreate or survive? What Darwinian value would you have in aesthetics or the search, seeking out beauty?
Why do we write symphonies or books of philosophy?
Why would we ever come to a book club like this?
Chris, can you help us out here?
This is a subject I was hoping was going to come up earlier.
No.
We don't have nearly enough time to talk about it, probably, but a couple things, and people can respond to any one of them. One, I don't know what an unintelligible universe is like. Like, I don't even have a conception of how that would even operate, because I think that intelligibility comes with order, and we cannot exist in a chaotic universe. With things like art, beauty, love is mentioned, I think, in the Paul Gould chapter. Well, actually, I'll set that one aside because it's different. But art, beauty, music, symphonies, these are not required under theism either. But you could have a very boring, uncreative universe that still has God at its center and as creator. So I don't think that should be unfairly applied to one side of the argument.
So how can we have an uncreative creation?
Well, I mean, okay, maybe artistic would be a better way of putting it. But
I think, though, the most basic question is the fact that we're talking about these means that we are conscious and have rationality. But if that evolved and there is no creative force, then that means somehow the rational came from irrational things, because that's what quantum physics points to, that it's not rational, that it is, right, that consciousness came from things that aren't conscious, but somehow we develop consciousness. Do you see what it's almost that's where I see it as what she's saying, is that the fact that we have this image, and this is how I'm going by what she was talking about with Kepler, is because it doesn't make sense. It's not just a jump from the universe existed, now we have the fine-tuning. That's a huge jump, and that's awesome. But then she's pointing out, then there's this next jump of the jump from non-living to life, which we have no explanation. And then there's the jump from that which is alive to that which is conscious, like animals, for example. And then from that to that which is rational and can reason. And each one of those has to come from something that
And
isn't.
if reason is merely
How
an
does reason come from the
accident,
unreasonable?
a
That's
branch
why I
off
kinda
in
go, ooh, you know.
evolutionary development of somehow, why do we trust it? Why do we think that that's going to be something that actually works?
Ken has the answer.
Okay.
No, I don't
I'm
claim
curious.
to have
That's-
all the answers, but there's a genetic fallacy embedded in that question
Oh,
as well.
okay.
Like, it's like saying, well, how can wetness come out of hydrogen and oxygen? You know, neither one of those is wet, and yet oxygen and hydrogen combine together to make wet water. So, I mean, it's not a strong argument against what you're saying, but it's an argument to say that one thing does, you know, just because you have consciousness doesn't mean it has to come from consciousness. It can come from non-consciousness. It's not an insurmountable. It's difficult, yes, but
I'm
it's
just
not a
saying,
category.
it's a jump
Yeah.
for which we, as conscious rational beings,
Right.
say, wait,
So-
our what we see
Yeah, I
is
mean,
that.
it may be a jump, but it either happened or it didn't.
Right, and that's what I'm saying.
we
So
may
there's-
not-
Some cases it didn't.
I am with all the theists. I'm with all the theists in saying that all of these problems that you're raising are difficult, like the fine-tuning problem, the origin of life, the origin of consciousness. These are difficult, right? So, but if you apply, they all fall under the category of the anthropic principle. If you can imagine for a moment that all of this was possible and it could have happened, that's the only thing that would allow us to be even having this conversation, right?
But
Just
that
like-
puts naturalism in the God of the gaps, because then you're saying, well, science will someday
Well,
explain this. Do you see what I'm
let's
saying?
just have, I mean, the way I see it is that these, yes, are difficult, and I grant you that it's wildly improbable to even think that this would happen, but if we're here and that did happen, okay, so I'm just asking you to suspend your skepticism for a moment and assume that it did happen, right? All of these things happen naturalistically. Then I'm looking at the world and seeing the kind of world that we live in, right? A world that is, like I mentioned, huge and very, very old, which would have been required in order for all of this to happen. So these dice are rolling and checking off for me. At a world where there's immense suffering that's distributed randomly is a prediction of naturalism, but not necessarily of theism. It might be compatible with theism, I'll grant you that, okay, for the sake of argument. But all of these things I'm ticking off, and I'm seeing the way the world is. It's like Dawkins talking about, this is the world we would expect to see if there was no personality behind it. Assuming that we got here to begin with. That's the hard part. Getting here to begin with. But once we're here to begin with to have this conversation, then we start to look at the world, and what do you know? It looks like a world in which there's no benevolent force.
I'm thinking the same thing from my worldview, going, no, it looks exactly like what I would expect from.
Because you're here, and you
Yeah.
have a conscious mind to think about it. But if we
I'm
assume
saying
that it's already
analogy,
there.
you know, we know the biogenic law, life begets life. And so I'm just saying what we understand of the rules
Right.
seems to point to God more.
Right, it's an argument where I'm asking you to suspend that skepticism for a moment,
Yeah.
so that you can put yourself in a position where you can look at the world, and then after you're already here, then you're looking out at the world, and by golly, it looks like a world that, yeah, we're here magically somehow, but it looks like a world where there's no benevolent presence in it, and it looks like it would have to be in order, if there was no God, to bring it about.
But you would grant that a universe that has that's finite, that had a beginning, that's not eternal, which seems to be the prevailing view, it would be a big check in the area for the Christian or theistic worldview. Would you say
that it's a finite but not infinite? I mean, old
Yeah.
but not infinite.
Right.
Well, I mean, I guess there's.
I would think naturalism would posit an eternal universe.
I have a hard time thinking about infinity. I'm pea-brain, so I don't even.
Well, I think there's a reason for that, because it's illogical on some levels. Time has to be finite.
Yeah. So I mean, not every naturalist has espoused an infinitely aged universe. I mean,
Well, what did you think of, like, the
Now they know
laws
better.
of, the laws, well, like Frank Turk was saying, you got these abstract laws of logic, abstract mathematics, and then somehow the human mind is able to comprehend it. Did she make a compelling argument?
That's a good point, because you often hear the argument from natural or evolutionary
Argument against naturalism.
The evolutionary argument against
Against
that EAN.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
something that Nancy Percy likes it.
Right,
That's
right,
her
right.
hobby horse.
Could you just summarize it briefly?
Yeah, and you were raising it actually just a minute ago, and I wanted to respond to that by saying, well, if we evolved from naturalistic processes, how can we trust our intellect and to be
Well,
able
and
to...
even understand laws of logic and mathematical
Right.
things.
So my answer to that is pretty basic and simple. It's like, well, so you're faced with the question, how do I know that my mind can operate rationally, right? Or any of our minds can operate rationally. Well, we've sent people to the moon, and we have iPhones, so we know that we can think rationally, right? There's evidence.
I wouldn't use iPhones.
There's
if you
fruit.
wanted.
Yeah, there's fruit. There's fruit that proves that the consequence of our intellect brings a fruit that proves that we do have intellect. So we don't have to wonder, are we rational or are we not? Our rationality is limited, yes, but it's very powerful. We can do all sorts of things with it. So however we got here, we are rational at least to an extent. So we don't have to wonder about it, right? You see what I'm saying?
Right.
All right,
But
so,
what better predicts it or grounds it?
Right.
so under
It's not a given.
under evolution, you would expect that well, to even have this conversation, goes back to the anthropic principle. To even have this conversation, we have to be rational. But you can imagine that being able to reason confers you an advantage evolutionarily. If you know how to set a trap for an animal in the forest, you're clever. You can figure that out, or you can count your sheep, or whatever. All these things do serve a purpose. Now we've extended it far beyond what evolution.
Yeah, what's the
took us.
survivability of understanding tensor field theory and quantum mechanics?
right.
And
I think that's kind of the crux of what the Christians are trying to get at. Is it seems like human beings are so rational and so creative. It's like not just beneficial for survival, not just a little beyond it. It's like super overkill.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like all the other animals are kind of at this level where they're smart enough to survive, or maybe a little bit smarter, and humans are like way
I
up
think
there.
a lot of that is cultural. We have so we don't have we don't have just biological evolution that has got us to this point. You go to the forests of like in the pygmies of Central Africa or whatever, living in the trees. They're living a very basic existence. Yes, they're smart, but they're applying their smartness to surviving in the wild. We have built ourselves a culture that has taken us to the moon, but that's through education and iterative advancement over many generations. So I mean, it's something that's built up over time.
But that also needs an explanation. Why is there this drive to learn and to pursue these kinds of things?
I think it's like, like Dawkins likes to use the analogy of morality. Why do we care about, why are we altruistic? And he explains it based on the maternal instinct. So nature has given us this kernel of desire to care for the other, especially our own children. But we've come to expand that to other people and to our adopted children. We can love them just the same way we love our own biological children. So nature gives us this kernel that we can apply not just to the immediate concern that nature gave it to us for, but a much wider circle. So, and especially if you compound that over the generations through education and culture, then it becomes a huge advantage to our species.
Well, it seems like the club barely got started, and it is that time, boys and girls. So I just want to remind you, there's still some copies left of both the audio and the book itself, for the December book. And be sure to help us get the word out about the next month's book, Pale Blue Dot. On the back, you have the links to get the book or the free audio version that's on YouTube currently. So thanks so much for being here. Let me just get one more quick question. How many, this is your first Atheist and Christian book club? Raise your hand. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Thanks. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
What are you doing, Joyce?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Battlefield of the mind. Next.